The International Crane Foundation is based on a nearly 300-acre facility in Baraboo, Wisconsin, where it's the only place in the world where you can see all 15 of the world's crane species. Our speaker this evening, Dr. Richard Beilfuss, has had a long association with the International Crane Foundation and since the 1980s, and he served as its president and CEO since 2010. From 2006 to 2009, Richard lived in Mozambique with his family, where he served as Director of Conservation Services for the Gorongosa National Park. From 1992 to 2006, he was responsible for developing and managing the International Crane Foundation's regional program in Africa, where he built a team of staff and partners in more than 20 countries across Africa, seeking deep connections with the communities who share their lands with cranes, and spearheaded public and private efforts to implement innovative water management practices in the water-stressed Zambezi River Basin for the benefit of cranes, many other species, and human livelihoods. Over his 30-year career, Richard has engaged in water management and wetland restoration efforts in more than 50 countries across Africa and Asia, with a particular focus in Nepal, Vietnam, Mozambique, and Zambia. He has contributed to the restoration and management of thousands of acres of prairie and savanna landscapes in the US Midwest. He's authored more than 100 scientific papers, technical reports, proceedings, and lay audience publications, and presented his research findings and conservation vision to governments, communities, and peer scientists worldwide. Richard is a licensed professional hydrologist with a PhD in land resources, wetland ecology, and master's degrees in civil and environmental engineering, hydrology specialty, and in water resources management, and he has a bachelor's degree in economics. Richard was appointed by the governor of Wisconsin to serve on the examining board of professional geologists, hydrologists, and soil scientists. We're honored to have you as our speaker tonight, Rich. Thanks for coming. Virtually.
Thank you. Thanks, Bill and Susan, Chuck, everyone. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak to the DFO and to join you tonight. So, hello, everyone. Sorry I can't see all of you or be in the room, but virtual it will be, and I will enjoy sharing some stories with you tonight. So I'm going to share my screen here, make sure that it's all looking fine. Hopefully you can see cranes, ambassadors for conservation. Somebody else will hopefully tell me if that is not what you're seeing. So yeah, as Bill said, I've been with the International Crane Foundation for quite a while. I most of my career has been with well, all of it in bird-related conservation, most of it in the crane world. There's my little circle of photos here, show that I was actually born and raised in Chicago, and have had really wonderful opportunities to work overseas with a lot of wonderful people. Quite a bit of my time, I think, as Bill mentioned, working in Nepal and in Vietnam, some very old shots of me, and in Africa, a lot working on water resources issues, and had a wonderful opportunity for about 4 years to work for Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique, which was a really, really nice opportunity actually to focus in on one place only for some years and try to solve problems at one place. I'm proud to have raised a couple of boys who are now very big, tried to turn them into land restorationists and pyromaniacs and all that good stuff. And my wife and I live in Madison, Wisconsin, and our two boys are about. So all this 30 years in the crane world, and of course my favorite bird is the red-headed woodpecker. So all right, so what I'm going to try to do here tonight is answer the question, why cranes? Why is there this group up about an hour or so north of Madison in Baraboo, Wisconsin, which is otherwise only known as being the home of the circus, And why cranes? And hopefully leave you with this idea. Cranes are not just for birders. I know maybe I'm speaking to a mix of birders and not birders out there, but that's my story and I'm going to stick to it here. So what I want to do first is give you some reasons on this issue of why cranes from some different perspectives. And then I'd like to share 3 stories for you. One from Africa, just to give a flavor for some of the international work around crane conservation, and then talk about the whooping crane story, our rarest bird in North America, and the sandhill crane story, the most successful crane species in the world. So I'll circle around. So why cranes? So reason number 1 is that cranes are ancient, elegant, and inspiring part of our culture. So what do I mean by that? Well, I'll just share some photos to give you a sense of that. This is the red-crowned crane of East Asia, the elegant blue crane, national bird of South Africa, the gray-crowned crane of East and Southern Africa, which almost defies description as one of the more ornate birds you're ever going to find, with its golden crown and Muppet-like face, and just an amazing bird. This is the Siberian crane, which is critically endangered. And also, it's giving us a good example, something I'll show a little video clip. Another reason cranes really resonate with people is they have something called a unison call. Here's a little sample of it. It's a 2-part harmony between males and females. You can see on the left of the screen there, male and a female going together doing this little call. And it's a unique thing in the crane world, this 2-part harmony between the males and females. They can also be amazingly playful and goofy. This is a pair of wattled cranes from our site in Baraboo. This is the female on the right trying to get the attention of the male on display here, and doing just about everything she possibly can to get his attention. He's not seemingly responding much today, but maybe let's see, throw a stick up in the air. Oh, we'll catch a ball. She's having some fun. He is not interested today. So. Well, cranes are also known as great parents. This is a pair of whooping cranes with a young chip. The male and females both incubate the eggs for about a month, just shy of a month, and they jointly rear the chicks as well. So they're very nurturing parents of their precocial chicks there. They also do amazing migrations. These are black-necked cranes flying through the mountains of Bhutan, crossing over parts of the Himalayas, and they congregate in magnificent numbers. And many of you have probably been to the show nearby there on the Platte River. If you haven't, it's really a must. It's kind of the Serengeti of the US with this concentration of sandhills. And there's quite a few crane species that congregate in huge numbers like that on stopover or wintering grounds. Here's a scene of our sandhills on the Wisconsin River. And just a joy to watch in their big numbers. Yeah, if you haven't done the flying flat there, it's a must to get out and see these birds. You know, wonderful way to experience it. So for all those reasons, their elegance, and they're the tallest flying birds on 3 different continents and in the world. They resonate with people, and they've been with us for millennia. These are cave drawings. These photos taken out in Utah, cave drawings showing sandhill cranes. This is a painting that was done here in Wisconsin. The Ojibwe Crane Clan in northern Wisconsin celebrates the crane as their totem, as their the namesake of their band. And this is a painting that was done called "The Last Watering Hole: Creating a New World," where the elders are taking counsel from the animals, and there's a crane in there expressing his needs for the shaping of the new world. I just love this painting. In Australia, the Brolga is credited in myth and legend with the creation of the sun, that the sun in Aboriginal culture was created out of a crane egg that was thrown up into the sky. Moving across into Southeast Asian Buddhist culture, this is a lying or sleeping Buddha in the country of Myanmar. And if you look on the bottom of his foot, you see a crane there in gold. And the crane is one of the final auspicious reincarnations of the Buddha. And so it's a highly revered bird as one of the final stages for the Buddha before the Buddha ultimately became human and then became enlightened. So they're incredibly important in in the Buddhist religion. And likewise in Hinduism, Saras cranes are featured in the oldest, kind of most significant Hindu book, the Ramayana. It's about 4th century BC, nearly 2,000 years, well, more than 2,000 years ago. It's 2,500 years ago. And it's a story of the acknowledgement of suffering over the shooting of a crane. And it's widely considered to be one of the first poems ever written, inspired by that. In East Asia, you see cranes in everything, wedding kimonos, and famously at Hiroshima is the creation of the 1,000 origami cranes as a symbol of peace after the horrors there. I can sort of go on and on, but they're deep in our culture worldwide. And that extends not only across Asia, but also in Africa. The country of Uganda has a crane right in the center. If you look here on the left, right in the center of their national flag, it's a crane. They're also on the coat of arms. The national bank is called the Crane Access Bank. The national soccer team is called the Cranes. Go Cranes Go. And their largest banknote, the 20,000 shilling, has a crane on it as well. So they are really, again, deep in culture of these countries. We've found every single species of cranes on somebody's stamp. I think about 70 different countries have cranes on their stamps, and they've managed to invade just about every aspect of our commercial and public society today, on teas, on beers, on coffees. This is, believe it or not, the insignia of the Macon Whoopee semi-pro hockey team in Macon, Georgia, miso, and on and on and on, currencies of many countries. So they're really deeply embedded into our culture. And this is a clip from Zambia. Give you a little idea of what happens when that goes too far. These are two crown cranes that are the mascot for the Zambian army and march along with the army. So, need I more? Well, that's one reason why cranes, when we think about why we exist, but there's other important reasons too. Another big one is cranes are indicators of a healthy environment. What I mean by indicators is the conditions needed to sustain cranes are very good indications of the broader health of the environment we live in. One important reason is they require very large breeding territories. Many of the species require large, very intact wetlands to rear their chicks. I'll show an example later of a species, the wattle crane, that's very closely linked on their breeding grounds to those conditions. The whooping crane, famously down on the coast of Texas, I'll talk about that story a little bit, but a little bit later, they feed on a diet of blue crabs and other sea life that is only available in the bays at a certain level of salinity. And if you have too much salinity, that is a lack of freshwater inflows, as I'll talk about later. Their food source disappears and the cranes can no longer use the coast. So they're very good indicators of that delicate balance coming into the estuaries. The wattled crane, along with the Siberian crane and several other cranes that have largely a vegetarian diet, they feed on submerged plants that produce underwater tubers, and those tubers are only produced under certain hydrological conditions when you have the right water clarity and depth. And so they are good indicators of those natural hydrologic conditions. So there's lots of cranes that can help us understand the health of a, let's say, more pristine or natural environment. But cranes are increasingly valuable as indicators of the health of our farms and our working lands too. This is a nest in the country of Myanmar by a Saras crane. Saras cranes are the world's tallest flying bird, this little egg right in the middle here in the foreground. This is not a natural wetland, but it's a rice field. But the kind of rice grown is called floating rice or suspended rice. And this kind of rice is very productive when you have when it's not cropped too heavily and when it's used in a way that's compatible for wildlife. So it's a good indicator. And likewise, these black-necked cranes, they nest in the high montane wetlands of the Tibetan Plateau, and they depend entirely on glacier runoff in those areas to feed these wetlands. So they're a good indicator of our increasing understanding of climate change and how our landscapes are changing. So in addition to their cultural values, cranes are also good sensitive indicators of environmental change. And through a combination of those two things, they're very good flagships for saving places. We know some of those places here in the US, like the Mississippi Sandhill Crane National Wildlife Refuge or Aransas Wildlife Refuge, some of the many refuges that protect cranes across this country. And overseas, there's an equally remarkable story. For example, in Southeast Asia, in the Mekong Delta, the Mekong River Delta, 6 national reserves have been set up to protect cranes. And in doing so, they protect the last remaining wetlands of that whole area, which has otherwise been converted to industrial rice and settlements. And when you work to save cranes, again, they're flagships for many other species in those areas, maybe lesser known species, lesser understood species, that are able to benefit from those protected areas or conservation areas. And likewise in China, they've just done a remarkable job. There are 46 national crane nature reserves across China, and they protect more than 70 million acres of land around cranes. And of course, many, many other species benefit from this. One of the areas that the cranes spend in the winter has almost all of the world's swan geese, about half of the world's tundra swans, and many, many other species. So again, great side benefits to the conservation of these areas. In Africa, we see cranes connected with most of the wetlands of international importance under the Ramsar Convention and other protected wetlands across Africa. And they're important species for getting those areas designated. And they co-occur with a lot of the great wildlife in Africa. This is a great floodplain up in the southern part of Chad, the country of Chad in Central Africa, which is loaded with elephants and many other species sharing this landscape with the cranes. And also sharing these landscapes are people. And a lot of the crane conservation that we do, a lot of the work out in the world is not just about protecting pristine landscapes, but about protecting people landscapes. And that's certainly true in the crane world, where they co-occur with, whether it's with fishing communities in China or on agricultural lands in India, or with livestock and camels and cattle and sheep and goats in the plains of Chad. They co-occur with people, and a lot of times you can think of cranes not only as flagships for protecting pristine areas or natural areas, but also human-dominated landscapes and the ways that we can co-occur together. So that's 3 of the roles of the Y cranes question: their cultural connection, their sensitivity as indicators of health in the environment, and their role as flagships. But increasingly, what brings great power to this work, I think, is the way that people work together for cranes at a time when we've never needed to work together more. This photo here was taken as part of the Siberian Crane International Cooperative Program that was done as a global environmental facility grant, and it brought together India and Pakistan, China and Russia, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, even Iran, and these are countries all across the region that haven't worked together well historically. That came together for the future of the critically endangered Siberian crane. And likewise in Korea, North and South Koreans work together in crane conservation. There's not a lot of things North and South Koreans agree on or work on together, but one of them is cranes. And I think in these times when we are in all kinds of tensions across the globe, it's good to remind ourselves of the common things that we share. The beloved way cranes are celebrated in China. This is one of their big song and dance productions in celebration of cranes. They connect us. They help shrink the world. Our teams across Africa, we work in many, many different countries across Africa. There's just so many ways they bring us together. And one fun way they bring us together is through crane festivals. There are, I think, about 30 or 31 crane festivals celebrated each year around the world in different communities in different countries around the world. This is a scene from a black-necked crane festival in the highlands of Bhutan, where people come together at this monastery to support the return of cranes for winter. And you have a really wonderful crane festival just nearby you, up in the Yampa Valley there to the west of Denver there. Wonderful festival run by my dear friend Nancy Merrill and her team, the Colorado Crane Conservation Coalition, CCCC. And that their next one is coming up end of August this year. Hope you can make it up there for that. It's a lot of fun. So if you're keeping track at home, we've talked about cultural connections. We've talked about their role as indicators, as flagships, bringing people together, all really wonderful reasons to go work for cranes, go sign up for your nearest crane work opportunity. But there's another reason too, and that is that cranes really need our help. The crane family has 15 species. There are 15 species of cranes. 10 of them are on the red data list for being endangered, 10 of the 15. And even among the 5 that are not on the red data list, including our sandhill cranes, many populations at the state level and at the migration level are highly threatened. And so even the so-called safe cranes have enormous conservation challenges. So it is one of the most endangered families of birds on Earth. In fact, I think the only family that's more endangered right now is the one that was mentioned in the introductory comments, the vultures. And vultures across Africa and Asia, I think, is the only family of birds, larger family of birds that's more endangered. And the reason why they're endangered is no different than what's facing us as bird conservationists, as land conservationists around the world. It's the old problem of living on the land without spoiling it, the challenge of wetland loss, of grassland loss, of changes in water regulations that change the way waters are managed, and water pollution, or invasive species, or cattle, or fire, other challenges like that. They basically face all the kind of challenges that we face for the many species that we're trying to protect and keep on Earth. And then compounding all of that, of course, now is broader changes in our climate, global warming areas where water levels, where water scarcity is increasing, where water levels are rising. All those challenges that really just compound the challenges that we face in trying to secure our lands and waters. Well, there are a lot of people out in the world working for cranes. Those stars are where there are projects underway around the world in crane conservation. We call them craniacs. So this is the world of craniacs that goes well beyond the work of the organization I work for, the International Crane Foundation, but we do try to spearhead and catalyze a lot of that work. This is our current map of the world there. So this map shows the 15 crane species around the world. And then those big stars are places where we have offices trying to coordinate efforts. So including in Beijing, China, here in Russia, down in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam. And then we have offices in Uganda and Kenya, Zambia, and South Africa, and here in Beilfuss, Wisconsin, where I'm coming to you nearby, and in Texas. So we use those as opportunities to spearhead crane conservation work around the world. So I want to share a few stories with you tonight. I want to start out with one international story just to give you a flavor for how these different things I talked about, cranes as indicators and flagships and bringing people together, kind of play out in the world with different people working together to save them. So I'll tell you a story from Southern Africa for the wattled crane, and then we'll go over and talk about some stories closer to home here. So this first story I want to talk about is restoration of the Kafue Flats in Zambia. That's in Southern Africa. It's a project that we call a thriving floodplain for all. And as this picture kind of gets at, we're trying to find projects common ground between cranes, other wildlife, birds and mammals and everything else, and people in these shared landscapes. Well, the Kafue Flats is in Southern Africa. This is a map of Southern Africa showing where Zambia is. And then the Kafue Flats is in the central part of Zambia, not far from the national capital, Lusaka. In fact, it provides about half of the national fisheries, about half of the national cattle production. And it's a big floodplain system of remarkable conservation value. The Kafue River meanders through this plain and dumps water out on it into this enormous floodplain area, more than 1,500 square miles, all kinds of wonderful pools and lakes and swampy areas across the plain and upland surrounding grasslands, capable of supporting very huge herds of wildlife, zebra and buffalo and wildebeest and many other animals out on these water plains, hippos in the deep water areas, and all tremendous wildlife values. And in particular, it supports a couple of species of great conservation concern. This is the Kafui lechwe, which is an aquatic antelope. Looks a little bit something like our deer here, but is it's a highly aquatic antelope. See in pictures like this moving across these plains. It's found only in the world in this place on the Kafui Flats. And so that's a species of high conservation concern for us. And likewise, it is a vitally important area for birds. It's a wetland of international importance under the Ramsar Convention for its bird life. And more than 470 bird species have been recorded on the Kafui Flats, including the species shown here, like the slaty egret, many species of ducks and other waterfowl, and shorebirds on the edges and all. So it's a very important wetland system for birds and for African vultures. It has several species, and it's been declared a safe zone for vultures, where there's active efforts underway to try and secure the vanishing vultures of Africa, like some of these species shown here. In our world perspective, there are two species of cranes that are found on the Kafui Flats. One is the gray-crowned crane. It is an endangered species. There's about 30,000 or so left globally, but they're in rapid decline right now across a lot of East Africa into Central Africa. And the other crane species is the wattled crane. It's a vulnerable species, but it is decreasing, and there are less than 10,000 of these birds globally. It's the tallest flying bird in Africa. Pretty amazing bird. And the Kafui Flats itself has about a third of all of the world's wattled cranes, a little bit over 3,000 in number. And so they are really the star attraction across, along with the Kafui lechwe, out on the Kafui Flats. Well, what are wattled cranes doing out on the Kafui Flats? They feed on aquatic vegetation and the submerged rhizomes of these plants. This is a species called Eleocharis. Has several different species, but it's a spike rush. It's a type of spike rush. And when it has good water conditions, it produces these underground tubers, and that's what sustains these birds. They also lay a platform nest. This blue arrow is pointing out to a couple of eggs here. I don't know if you can see them or not. In a sea of water is this little platform nest, and they actually lay their eggs at peak water levels. And then as water levels start to decline, they're able to feed their young chicks on the explosion of life that occurs on these floodplains as water levels decrease at the end of the flooding season. So they're very good, very sensitive indicators to the health of this floodplain system. And they're in great numbers on the plain, so that's a wonderful thing. The floodplain also has enormous human value. It provides many ecosystem services to the country of Zambia, to the region, and to the local communities that live there. Everything from clean water to broad biodiversity values to storing carbon, purifying water, many values for society, and especially at the local level, natural resources for building materials, fisheries for the local population, livestock grazing grounds, and water supply are critically important from this floodplain to the people that live all around this floodplain system. And it's also increasingly, sadly, but increasingly importantly, a climate change oasis. The waters that come into this floodplain come from far in the north of Zambia, and it can hold water late into the dry season when much of the region is extremely dry and parched. So it also can really sustain people and wildlife in times when the rest of the country is bone dry. So those are all good and wonderful things about the Kafui Flats. It is an amazing place, one of my favorite places on earth, but it also is facing many challenges. There are many people living all around the flats. The demands on the resources are great, and it leads to immense conservation challenges. And I want to talk about some of those. A biggie is around the unsustainable harvest of wildlife. There's a number of reasons why, often called poaching, why that's very heavy there. But you have a very poorly funded law enforcement force in Zambia supporting the park. Lack of a community engagement. Community is excluded from the flats in most of the activities that they want to do. So most of the activities inside are, their options inside the park are mostly unsustainable, some of them illegal. There's a lot of hunting for urban bushmeat markets, that is moving the meat out to distant urban areas like the capital, Lusaka, where there's a great demand for meat from the floodplain. And all of this has led to the near loss of a number of the wildlife species out there, like zebras and African buffalo and wildebeest, and a rapid decline in lechwe. I don't have a whole lot of data I'm going to throw at you in this talk tonight, but this has been the population trend for lechwe, a species that we've been monitoring very carefully. They've declined by about 80% over the last 40 years, 50 years. And a lot of that is the result of this hunting pressure and encroachment out on the flats. And again, this is the only place on Earth where these lechwe occur, where the species occur. They've been lost over time to the outer areas of the flats and are more and more concentrated in the middle, shown with these brown dots out here across the core part of the Kafui Flats floodplain. And their habitat's been shrinking, and they've been hunted heavily. Then more broadly, there's other changes to the system that are big challenges that include large dams upstream, altering the timing of floodwaters, both the depth and duration of flows, sometimes the quality of flows. And then the litany of things that we have as many challenges here in the US, invasive species coming in to the floodplain like this Mimosa pigra, invasive weed, and fires that occur during the dry season that are out of control and burn up a lot of the floodplain. So these are some of the challenges we're facing on the flats. And as well, unsustainable development of the wetland. This is a fishing village, an incredibly remote fishing village out on the plain. And it's also the highlands that those fishing villages occupy are also the critical place for lechwe and other species during the dry season. So a lot of competition over areas. And in general, human-wildlife conflict, competing between cattle, for example, these brown and black dots out here, and the lechwe shown in purple. A lot of competition for resources. And you can see that out in the plain. This blue circle shows cattle, and there's a red circle of a herd of lechwe, and they're increasingly getting cornered and crowded out from the spaces that they need. Well, from a bird view, that all is bad news, because both the gray-crowned crane and the wattle crane are highly associated with lechwe and other grazing animals. So in addition to the challenges of losing those beautiful mammals, it's also having a catastrophic effect on a lot of bird life that needs that grazing activity to utilize the floodplain to free up areas for their own feeding grounds there, or release of vertebrates or other needs. So big challenges there. So what's a group of craniacs to do about that? That is our mission, and that's the story I want to tell now from Zambia. First thing we've done is made a long-term commitment to manage and restore these protected areas, a 20-year agreement, which is a cooperative management partnership with the government of Zambia to restore and manage this area. And that includes 2 national parks, Blue Lagoon National Park to the north, and Lochinvar National Park to the south of the main Kafui River. And in red, this broad area is called a game management area. And that whole area is under management now. So we've committed for 20 years to really support all of that core management of those 2 parks in that bigger floodplain. And equally, maybe even more important, we've made a long-term commitment to the communities who share in this area to be involved in every aspect of the future of this park. So we've hired and brought community members into law enforcement, into management decision-making for the park, kids into public education and awareness about the values of the park, and involved communities well in land restoration activities and in research, so that they can really feel a part of this wetland and this wetland recovery story. My favorite example from this work out there now was engaging communities to remove Mimosa pigra, the invasive weed. Our goal was to remove about 95% of this weed that was covering more than 5,000 acres of the floodplain and growing rapidly. And we hired the communities to remove it, with the goal of trying to restore habitat for cranes and other wildlife. And that's been a fun story. That dark red on there is Mimosa pigra. with the communities been actively cutting it and removing it back and exposing a lot more open marsh area over the years, getting those patches smaller and smaller, and in doing that, opening up a lot more access for wildlife onto the flats there on that critical edge area that they use. And it's been a wonderful story. Water birds and Kafui lechwe are returning to the area. They've recorded 3 new bird species for the country of Zambia in those cleared areas. So it's really opened up some nice habitat as native plants have regenerated. And critically, it allows a safe pathways access for wildlife to move and get access to open waters. So it's just some of the many species that have benefited from that restoration. But there's an equal and important side to the story, and that's the human benefit of that work, being able to create jobs for 450 people and generate cash in an area where there is almost no cash for school fees, roofing people's homes, making small business investments, lots and lots of other uses. People have enough food in this area, but they don't have cash. So employment is really, really critical. And it opens up pathways to water for people as well, livestock and fishing. And we had a PhD and a master's student be able to work out of this as well. So it's that combination of the ecological benefit and the human benefit, which is what gives us hope for the long term, for the future and the long term thriving of this area as a floodplain that can remain an important floodplain in Zambia. And we can slowly work together and get buy-in from communities to solve the many challenges that we face out in this floodplain over time. So that's an example of the way through Cranes we try to bring people together and solve problems. All of these are stories that are ongoing. As I said, this is a 20-year commitment in the case of the Kafui Flats to turn it around. But it is our firm belief across the crane world that working with people on these landscapes is our best bet for trying to sustain them and restore them in the long run. And that's what we pursue. Jumping over to North America here, I'll talk a little bit about the story of whooping cranes and sandhills. As I mentioned before, whooping cranes are the rarest crane species in the world, and actually, I think the rarest bird in North America, unless you feel there are ivory-billed or a few other species still out there. Certainly one of the rarest birds in North America. And the sandhill crane, which is the most abundant crane species in the world, the most successful crane species. So we have great stories of near loss and of abundance here in the US. So let's start off with these gorgeous whooping cranes, tallest flying bird in North America. Historically, they were probably never abundant. We know they nested on wetlands and tallgrass prairies from early accounts back to the 1600s. They migrated to winter on wetlands in the southeast into northern Mexico, as you can kind of see in this map, and then bred in the far north. Well, they were never abundant, but they were hit very hard by the market hunting era. I'll circle back to this again later, but they were hunted almost to extinction across their range. In fact, when they hit a minimum number in 1941, there were only 15 migratory whooping cranes known to exist in the wild in North America. So that close a shave with going extinct. And those few remaining birds were migrating between Aransas down in Texas, where they were protected at Aransas National Wildlife Reserve, which was created in the 1930s. And then their nesting grounds weren't actually discovered, at least by science, up until 1954 up in Canada, up in the region of wood buffalo. They were certainly known by the indigenous tribes up there, but they were unknown from a Western conservation view until the 1950s, which is pretty remarkable for such a large, bright white bird. That was the last of them. So that's a scene from Wood Buffalo National Park up in Canada. Their remote breeding grounds from there where they breed every year. They follow a long migration corridor, about 2,500 miles from far northern Canada down to the coastal Gulf Coast area in Texas. In doing so, they cross the tar sands of Canada, unfortunately, straight overhead, and they navigate a lot of power lines. There's actually a couple of cranes in that bottom photo there moving through, but they have a lot of perils along that very long migration route until they reach Aransas, where they winter. One of the interesting things about cranes and whooping cranes in particular is that when they get down to Aransas, they actually remain in their breeding pairs, and they remain as territorial pairs down on the coast of Texas, and they defend territories there. And we think the reason they do that on their wintering grounds is to find the good hunting grounds for their favorite food, which is the blue crab, those delicious blue crabs we all would like to eat. Cranes like to eat them too. They also eat snails and mussels and other species along the coast. And as I mentioned earlier, the story for that food availability on the coast is one of getting the salinities right. And so vitally important to whooping cranes down there on the coast, where their territory along the coast here is the availability of freshwater inflows coming in from the San Antonio and Guadalupe rivers that feed that coastal area and try to maintain that balance of freshwater and saltwater that cranes and other coastal species need. Well, the area they have chosen to read those last 15 wild birds, the area they ended up on is an enormous conservation challenge. There all kinds of shipping activity in the coastal waterway there, lots of land development pressure and land use pressure, and a great propensity to drought, as you probably know about that region of Texas. In fact, it really came to a head in 2009 to 2011. There was an extreme drought that actually created a new drought category during that drought called exceptional drought. And then pretty soon the whole state of Texas was in that exceptional state. And we had a die-off of about 10% of the whooping crane population, reminding us how fragile that comeback is for whoopers. So what is the whooper story there? What's it going to take to bring them back? We think there's two keys to it, according to the whooping crane recovery plan. One is securing the wild Aransas wood buffalo population that we've been talking about, that natural population that's recovered from only 15 birds. And the other is to try to reintroduce the birds with a couple of self-sustaining populations in the eastern part of North America where they were lost. So securing Aransas is really all about a couple of things. One is understanding the critical needs of whoopers, their habitat needs today and tomorrow. They're a coastal species, so they're vulnerable to land change and a sea level rise and other impacts along the coast. There's a lot we know about whooping cranes and their need for freshwater wetlands. As I mentioned, they have critical needs for a salinity balance. The salinity has a lot of impact on dietary availability for them. And they need to leave the coastal area for freshwater to drink and move more inland or for food in times of drought. So that critical knowledge about that balance. And then it's all about land and water. We estimate about 125,000 acres of high quality coastal marsh to sustain the full recovery of whooping cranes, and about 300,000 or so acres of adjacent coastal prairie further inland, which serves both as habitat now, more inland habitat for cranes and many other species, but also as future habitat with sea level rise if coastal areas are inundated. It's some of our best hope for retaining more inland areas along the coast as well. There are many protected areas along, but the future of those birds is largely going to depend on private lands, ranchers and private landowners through that area, and how the waters are used all along that future range for whoopers as they recover. Our bays and rivers, estuaries with the same kind of issues as we saw with the San Antonio and the Guadalupe River. And so the future of land and water on the coast is really going to determine the future of whooping cranes across that area. That's what we're all working for together to try to bring them back, trying to form partners with anybody who cares about the coast, who depends on the health of the coast and its abundant sea life, to try and find natural partnerships for those who share that need and can become partners for whooping cranes too. Of course, that includes activities today and in the future as we try to get more and more of the population in Texas and the Gulf Coast region interested in the fate of these birds and the future of these beautiful marshes. Well, it is a good story overall for whooping cranes. They are recovering nicely, that wild population. The numbers are growing each year. There's more than 500 in this wild. And this was a photo taken by a friend on the Platte River. I think just a stunning site, they had the highest count of whooping cranes on migration ever at the Platte River last year. Here they are together with the big numbers of sandhill cranes in the backdrop. It gives me hope that these birds are coming back. So, but we still have fundamentally the challenge of having all the whoopers in one population. So part of our challenge is to work for a second population, and that's the idea of reintroducing the second self-sustaining population. This has been a 22-year odyssey so far to try and bring them back. You may know a little bit of the story of bringing back the whooping crane, but I'll just give you the kind of the Cliff Note highlights here. It started with creating a whole bunch of captive breeding centers, basically getting the birds to pair in the wild. Lots of zoos were partners in this, including the Denver Zoo, Calgary Zoo, partners in Texas and Florida, New Orleans, and all rearing cranes, and then getting them to form pairs, and ultimately raising chicks in the wild that could be reintroduced. So here's a cohort of young chicks here that were being raised by people in costumes so that the cranes would not become imprinted on people. And then they would either be reared by those costume reared parents or actual parents of actual whooping crane parents, but they would be reared for eventual release into the wild. As we built up those pairs and all, then we could focus on their future breeding grounds, the release sites. And the first release site was up at Necedah National Wildlife Refuge in Wisconsin. And then a lot of people know this story. They had to be retaught their historic migration route. So they were flown behind ultralight aircraft by people on the aircraft, by Operation Migration pilots who were dressed as cranes and essentially attempting to fool these cranes into following them. And they did, reteaching these migration routes and lots of stopover sites along the way until reaching wintering grounds. And originally the wintering grounds were set up at St. Mark's and Chesapeake down on the coast of Florida. And it's kind of a funny story. So we started that odyssey back in the year 2000 with these migrations every year, and we would painstakingly fly these whooping cranes. You could only fly an ultralight 30 miles at a time. So from Necedah all the way down to Florida, they were flown 30 miles at a time each day when the weather was good, step by step by step by step by step by step, all the way down to Florida. It's like your worst nightmare of a road trip with a sick kid where you got to stop every 30 miles. And they had to do that and find willing farmers and landowners all along the way down there. So that was done for each cohort starting in 2000. But the amazing thing is, come the following spring, the birds would beeline straight back to Necedah area on their own without the ultralights. And they would do it in 3 or 4 stops, none of the stops that they were shown on the way down, and often entirely different migration corridors. So they clearly imprinted on the place where they were released and found their way straight back. And so the plan was for many years was to fly those birds down once, and then they would migrate on their own from then on. And then more recently, about in the last 5 years, we shifted out of the ultralight to just putting cranes in the wild with other wild whooping cranes to migrate with them, because there's now enough whoopers that have been reintroduced out in the wild that the young chicks can just be introduced out there as fully flighted juveniles, and then they can migrate with those birds. That's a process called direct autumn release. And then it's basically been an odyssey of learning and adapting. First, we learned that Necedah National Wildlife Refuge is sort of the world center for black flies, these miserable avian flies that just basically were munching these cranes into the point of where the cranes abandoned their nests. And so ultimately they just abandoned all their nests at Necedah. We weren't getting any chick productivity because their nesting season was timed to these explosions of black flies. So while we worked with Necedah National Wildlife Refuge to try and solve that problem, we started a new reintroduction site over in Horicon National Wildlife Refuge, which is towards the east of Wisconsin. Also lots of good habitat there, and so shifted that, fortunately, a bit out of the range of those black flies, so it gave more of a fighting chance for these reintroduced breeding birds. And then as well, we started a second introduction project down in Louisiana with partners down with Louisiana Fish and Game. And Louisiana, from that map, you probably didn't notice before, but Louisiana along the coast here, this was actually originally a non-migratory population on the east end, down in the southern end of that original remaining population towards Aransas and all. And here it was a migratory population up to Canada, but this part was a non-migratory population. So we had the opportunity to reestablish birds on migration across the eastern U.S. and birds that were permanent residents down in Louisiana. So that created different opportunities and challenges for the birds. So the good news, certainly from all of that, is we're getting chicks in the wild. And if you can see these little dots on here, there's a couple of chicks on a nest here and another chick on a nest here. And slowly these pairs are getting older in the wild, getting to be better parents and rearing birds. And that is great news. So we're excited with that part of the reintroduction story. But there are unfortunate sides to the reintroduction story as well. A big one has been illegal shooting of these whooping cranes. Actually, we've had about half of all the mortality in Louisiana has been from shooting of the birds. We've also had cranes being shot in Indiana, in Kentucky, and in Alabama, and in Texas. It's almost all of the shooting is not done by normal waterfowl hunters. It's done by vandals, usually teenagers, unfortunately. And so a lot of our effort through that range has been doing different kinds of hunter and public education, talking about identification so that people can tell a whooping crane from, for example, a sandhill in poor light and some of the other white birds, some of them with black primaries out there like wood storks and white pelicans and other things. And so really trying to help educate and hopefully turn the corner for these birds as they're trying to scrap their way back in the wild. And then as well, as we continue to learn, adapt, trying to deal with all the mesopredators that are out on the landscape, which are also a big challenge. All the native part of the landscape, like coyotes and bobcats, even great horned owls and raccoons and other animals, but in huge numbers, and a constant challenge for chick rearing parents out on these landscapes, these many landscapes. So where do we sit today? Whooping cranes are a conservation story in progress. Our estimate now is there's about 836 whooping cranes in the wild, about 543 in that Aransas wood buffalo population per the count this year. And there's equally about 76 or so in the eastern migratory reintroduced population and in that Louisiana non-migratory population as well. And then there's a few remnant birds from a reintroduction in Florida that was abandoned some years ago. So that's really the story of whooping cranes today. Again, a very rare bird, so rare that we can count them, right? So very few out in the world. And finally, I want to tell one last story, which is the story of our sandhill cranes, which is a great conservation success story. If whooping cranes are a story in progress, sandhills are definitely a success story and a fun story to tell. Of course, they're coming right near you there in Denver as well, in Colorado. This is a photo of a greater sandhill crane, and the map on the right is the migratory route of sandhills, both greater and lessers, and the crane species across the country from west to east. It is the most numerous crane species on Earth, and there are 3 resident populations of sandhill cranes in North America you may have heard of. One is down in Mississippi, the Mississippi sandhill crane, focused a small population in and around Mississippi National Wildlife Refuge. There is a resident population of sandhills in Florida and in Cuba, an endangered but still hanging on population down in Cuba. And then there's a whole series of migratory populations shown with these arrows across the country. The main mid-continent population that stops at the Platte, that is the huge numbers, more than 1 million birds that fly through the Platte each year. You've got the Pacific Coast population, the Rocky Mountain population near you, of course, and as well as the lower Colorado Valley River population that stops down, for example, in Bosque del Apache and down around that area. And then here in the eastern part of the U.S. where I am, you have the eastern population of greater sandhill cranes. And I'm going to mostly focus on the story of the eastern population, although a lot of it applies to sandhills across the country, including out where you are. This is the basic wheel of life for sandhills. They all spend their winter, mixed flocks of juveniles and adults, and some adults in different wintering grounds across the country. This is a scene from Wheeler National Wildlife Refuge in Alabama. And then that's where they are right now as we speak, spending the winter down in various areas in the south. And then they'll begin their migration in the spring, usually February to March, as they march their way north. Then they'll arrive in places like here in Wisconsin. Some years they'll even arrive so early they get snowed on. They can get buried, but they do arrive and then create their nests right away and begin laying eggs, usually, more or less around in April, with their hatchings time for mid-May, where they'll raise their chicks, hopefully if they're successful, out in agricultural areas or grasslands or ranchlands out west. And then they will begin to gang up late in the summer season, around August, September, and then make their move back south again, including their big congregations in the fall as they move through. In some areas, they congregate in huge numbers in the spring, like on the Platte, and in some areas in the fall and in the winter. So what happened to our sandhill stories? Why do we call sandhill crane a success story? Not long ago, it was a very different story for sandhills. A number of things led to challenges for the sandhill cranes over the last couple of centuries. Certainly one was the conversion of natural landscapes into agricultural landscapes, especially where we are in the Midwest here, where about 99.5% or so of our prairie landscape was converted into agricultural lands. And then that was compounded by very significant losses of wetlands across the United States over that period. In Wisconsin, we lost about half of our wetlands, but to the south of us, in those core states like Iowa, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, wetland loss of 80, 90% or worse. Big losses across that area. But the biggest reason why our sandhill cranes were nearly lost was market hunting. Similar situation to what happened with the whooping cranes. Sandhills were hunted for market in huge, huge numbers. And we kind of know that story from that century. Many species went extinct during that time, including our passenger pigeons and all. And we just about lost our sandhill cranes as well. They disappeared from Illinois and Iowa, South Dakota, Ohio, Indiana, and they were really on a terrible trajectory across the upper Midwest. Fortunately, remnant populations hung on in Wisconsin and Michigan, but we nearly lost these birds along with our whooping cranes, largely due to that habitat loss and market hunting. And at their low point, there was a beautiful essay written by the author Aldo Leopold. Maybe you've heard of Aldo Leopold or read some of his work. He wrote one of the most beautiful essays ever written, in my view, called Marshland Elegy. And it was essentially a eulogy for the sandhill crane. At that time, Aldo Leopold thought for sure sandhill cranes would be lost from Wisconsin as well, and maybe lost forever. And he wrote a lovely phrase, sad phrase: the sadness discernible in some marshes arises perhaps from their once having harbored cranes. Now they stand humble, adrift in history. So that was just about 70 years ago in the 1950s. But today we've had a really miraculous recovery of sandhill cranes. The population has just shot up. The eastern population of greater sandhills has really shot up since the 1960s. Now we have over 90,000 cranes migrating through Wisconsin each year. And it's been an amazing story of recovery. They're back on the landscape throughout, certainly Wisconsin and the Midwest. We have new birds, new breeding records every year, pushing east into Maine and New York, very heavily across new breeding pairs across Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and all. And it's just wonderful to see them radiating out. Where I live in Madison, 30 years ago, we had no cranes whatsoever in this part of southern Wisconsin. Now we have crane drains, crane beaches, crane crossings, crane soccer fields. All of this is just in Madison, Wisconsin, where I live. It's been amazing to see their rise here. And they've even cracked the elusive beer and wine market. You have crane labels for microbrew beers and micro wines in Wisconsin and Michigan. They've really made their way back. And this, believe it or not, is sandhill cranes flying past the Sears Tower in Chicago. And all of that really led to them great stories about it. This was front of the Chicago Tribune, once nearly gone. Sandhill cranes have come roaring back. So it's been a great story. And how did that happen? What happened with the Sandhill crane recovery? Well, basically, it started with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and really the end of that market hunting era. That was a huge part of turning the corner for cranes and many other species that were almost lost during that period. But an equally important part of the recovery was cranes' ability to adapt to the agricultural landscape across the Midwest that had been created along with other species, and notably the willingness of farmers to support cranes on these landscapes. So we attribute a lot of the sandhill crane recovery over the last 70 years since those kind of forlorn words of Aldo Leopold. We attribute a lot of that recovery to farmers and farmlands in the Midwest. And maybe not surprisingly, if we want to keep sandhill species, the sandhill crane successful as a species, then farmers are going to be the key to that today. So we focus a lot on cranes on the farm, across ranchers out west, but especially farmers out east. And the main reason is that sandhill crane numbers have really grown. They become a nuisance on some farms. They can actually move these little holes here. Oh, sorry, these little holes here are where cranes have drilled into the ground and removed fresh shoots of corn. And they can do quite a bit of damage on a cornfield. All of this brown area here is an area that was damaged by sandhill grazing. And this issue of cranes and crops is not a challenge only in Wisconsin, but also in many parts of the world where you have cranes on agricultural lands. And this is a scene from Kenya, where they're out on a farm. And in some cases where you have really poor communities, they can be a real threat to people's livelihoods. So we need sustainable, lasting solutions. We hopefully found one. We worked with a company to create the product Avapel, which is a bird repellent. It's a seed treatment. It is very successful when applied correctly and can really help significantly reduce crop damage. And one of the important things about Avapel is it deters crane. It's a non-toxic, nasty tasting treatment of the seed that cranes don't like. It tastes kind of peppery to them, and they spit it out. And they don't eat the seedlings, but they stay on the farm and they eat other things. And so it doesn't push the problem from one farm to the next. The birds stay on and they just feed on grubs and invertebrate and waste grain and other food sources, and not on those new shoots of corn that we're trying to keep them off. So Avapel works well for cranes and other seed pests out there, blackbirds and pheasants and other species. And so that's all a good thing. We have a solution, but we have challenges. A big one, farmers have to bear all the costs of buying that treatment. There is no compensation program for wildlife damage. It's inconvenient to apply on the farm. You have to buy Avapel and apply it separately to crop seed. And then if you apply it inconsistently, it's not as effective. So those are the problems we're working on today to try and bring back the sandhill in the Midwest landscape and continue their path of success. One is trying to get corn seeded with Avapel at the point of production, so that it's cheaper for farmers to buy as one package. So that's one thing we're hoping to achieve, and to improve extension on farms to try to better ensure where Avapel is being applied, that it is applied correctly and most effectively. So on farm extension work around Wisconsin, to try and improve that and use that as a model. And then one idea I'm really excited about is trying to create a new sandhill stamp, a non-hunting stamp for support of wildlife on farms. And we're hoping that will help generate all revenue spearheading directly towards offsetting the costs to farmers of either crop damage or of the use of purchasing Avapel to help prevent crops. So trying to, especially where farms are most vulnerable, small farms that are really vulnerable to the cranes, trying to come up with ideas that will help support those farmers. So in a lot of ways, our measure of success for sandhill cranes is not just more sandhills, but farmers and ranchers and landowners who love having cranes on their land and want to see them there in perpetuity. So in a way, it's no different from the story of sharing the coast for whooping cranes, or in sharing the floodplains of Zambia for wattled cranes. it's trying to find that elusive balance between cranes and people. So overall, when we look worldwide, we like to think cranes inspire us to solve big problems, to think about big conservation challenges, and to think about the healthy landscapes that we need for cranes, but also for people and for biodiversity as well. And that's really the story of crane conservation and the stories that I wanted to share with you. If you have a chance, I'll just put in a plug for our center in Baraboo. Please do come visit us. We're only a mile off the interstate. If you're driving east from Denver, we're just off of Interstate 94 in Wisconsin. We have all 15 species of the world in great exhibits where you can really see them and watch them feeding naturally and really learn their behaviors out in the wild, learn more about the birds themselves and efforts to secure them, and some of the stories like the whooping crane story and others in bringing them back. And I definitely encourage you, and I can't put in one more plug, but if you haven't been down to the Platte to that magnificent show, that's a must. And increasingly, we have a new festival in Wisconsin as well, where we have more than 10,000 greater sandhills on the Wisconsin River here. As they increase more and more, we have more and more opportunities to celebrate these birds in the wild, and it's a lot of fun. So hopefully stories like these inspire you to care and engage and act for cranes or for other birds. That's what it's all about. And I thank you all for joining and for being part of the conservation movement to bring back these birds and all of the birds that we care about. And then finally, I just want to thank many of the photographers. I labeled a lot of the slides, but not all of them on here, people that have contributed to our wondrous gallery of crane slides. And I thank you for joining. Thanks for being here. I'm going to stop my share, and I'm very happy to take some questions here.
Thank you, Rich, for a fascinating program covering the world, really. And I'm sure, like others, it's stirred terrific wanderlust in me of all your photographs of all these beautiful habitats and the wildlife in them, especially cranes. So it's a very, very informative and appealing kind of a program. Thank you very much for giving it to us. That's great. A couple of questions. One of our viewers wondered, that was a female wattle crane that was displaying right there at the beginning of your program?
Yeah,
So
and the video
females?
clip. Yeah, that was the female was trying to attract the male that day, who seemed to have no interest at all wandering around the field. But yes, that was a female who was wandering around and throwing things up in the air. Yeah.
Is that usual for wattle cranes for females to do it rather than the males?
It will go either way. So it's courtship. So sometimes it's the male courting the female, and sometimes it's the female courting the male. But they will do courtship displays both ways, and it's fun to watch. And it's a behavior that, because the birds are often far away, when you see them in the wild, it's a nice opportunity at places like our site where you can see them up close and see some of that behavior. So, yeah.
And is that true of all crane species, that sometimes it's the females that will do this displaying as well as the males?
Yeah, it is. Usually the males initiate the unison call, their two-part harmony call. But in terms of courtship, especially around the time when they start nest building, you'll see both species throwing twigs and rocks up in the air and moving around and just kind of getting in the mood and initiating dances as well. If you watch them, like on the Platte, you can see the male or the female initiating little dances up in the air as well.
Okay. Another question, please elaborate on the musical duet between males and females. You mentioned two-part harmony. Is this unique to certain species or true of all?
Yes, all of the crane species have a unison call. And Dr. George Archibald, who was the founder of the Crane Foundation, actually did his PhD on the unison call back in the late 60s, early 70s. And that was really the only reliable way to sex them, because it's very hard to tell cranes apart, as you know, out in the wild if you've watched them. But the uniqueness of their unison call is a great way to tell males from females. The male will initiate, and then the female will do a follow-up call on a different note. And they all do it. Some cranes do a lot of unison calling, some species, and some are are quieter, but in the wild, all 15 species do that wild unison call that you saw there. And Canada geese kind of have a little bit of a two-part call between males and females you can hear, but very few bird species, as I'm sure those on the program know very well, very few bird species overall have vocalizing by both pairs like that. So it's a really fun, unique thing about the crane world. And of course, you can watch both whoopers and sandhills unison calling here in the U.S. If you're out where they're territorial pairs.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there a difference in crane species, among crane species, in the number of eggs that they raise and lay rather, and chicks at fledglings, survival rate, differences among the various 15 species?
Yeah, there are. It's a great question, and it helps. I didn't talk much about differences between sandhills and whoopers and why sandhills have come back so much quicker than whoopers. But one of the reasons is whoopers tend to have only one chick per year. They will often lay 2 eggs, but when the first chick hatches, they'll often walk away and start feeding that chick intensively and just abandon the second egg. And sandhills much more reliably have pairs, not always, but in good breeding habitat. When they have good territories, they'll have 2 chicks. So that is good math for them. 2, 4, 6, 8 instead of 1, 2, 3, 4 for their recovery. And also as there's a wide variation around the world. Some of the most endangered crane species have only 1 chick per year. The record holders are that we've seen in the wild are the crowned cranes with those beautiful crowns. We've seen up to 4 eggs in a nest for crowned cranes. I've seen triplets in the wild, so it happens, and frequent twins. So the crowned cranes seem to be the most productive nesters of the different crane species, but there's quite about half of all cranes only reliably have 1 chick per year. So yeah.
And how about predation among the various crane species? You mentioned the various predators for whoopers, bobcats, coyotes, foxes, skunks, raccoons, on and on. How about, I know it's probably around the world differs, but how much is predation a factor in
it's particularly an acute problem here for the reintroduction, and I think it's largely a numbers game. There's you saw the numbers there. We only have 86 reintroduced whoopers across the eastern U.S. And those nests get targeted heavily by just the suite of predators. And I know wild sandhills certainly have a lot of egg predation too, but they have the numbers to kind of overcome predators. And so a lot of it is probably the low numbers on whoopers that they're getting hit so hard. And a big part of that reintroduction is just to continuously to get those numbers up. But predation is a problem for cranes everywhere. But as they get into more like the native, the surviving whooping cranes that are breeding way up in wood buffalo, Canada, they're in such a remote area that they have a much easier time evading predators. They don't have all those, kind of urban, semi-urban meso predators coming in, the raccoons and skunks and minks and opossums and all that can really hit those nests so hard. Mm-hmm. Over in Africa, we see some predation as well. You can imagine where you have lots of wildlife out in the area, but as long as there's reasonable tracts of habitat left, they do okay on predation. But by far the worst has been the whoopers here. Yeah.
Is there a problem with genetic diversity of whoopers when they were down and just coming up from 15 individuals in the 40s?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question, and it's a question we're never going to be able to fully answer, whether it's a problem. We know the good news is that some of the final surviving whooping cranes included representatives from the non-migratory Louisiana flock and the migratory Aransas sort of wood buffalo flock, as we call it. So we have genes from both of those populations, and that's a good thing. So at least there was some mixing at that point. The final birds weren't just from what could have ultimately just been close siblings of surviving whoopers, but we don't there's so many challenges to restoring them in the wild, to bringing them back. There are so many challenges that we don't really know if any of them are breeding depression issues or not. We don't think so, but we'll never know entirely if some of the issues that they're facing relate to that. So you sort of work with what you got. But fortunately, as the numbers keep picking up, they'll bring some more variability into the population. So, yeah, that is a challenge of getting down to so few birds for sure, though. Yeah.
Do people eat cranes for a food source?
They certainly do. They're eating them in about 10 U.S. states where they're hunted. They're certainly eating sandhills in Texas and Kansas and across now in Alabama and Kentucky and quite a few states that hunt them and up into Saskatchewan and Manitoba and all. Around the world, as I said early on in the talk, in Asia, the birds are really revered and closely associated with religion. And so in countries like India, Vietnam, China, Mongolia and all, they're really sacred birds, and they are not eaten, period. So all of the conservation is around habitat issues, and can be incredibly complex and challenging, but around habitat. In Africa, some of cranes are sometimes eaten, usually in times of hunger. So they're not a primary food. They're actually kind of a pain for people to catch compared to a lot of other things that they could be eating. But in times of hunger, we know that they're netted, and so they can be vulnerable. But by far the birds that are most eaten are sandhills, because they're hunted in so many states and provinces here. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And what's the average lifespan of whooping cranes and sandhills?
Yeah. The lifespan in the wild is, we think around 20, maybe 15 to 25 year range. 25 would be getting pretty old in the wild, but we have good examples of banded birds that live longer for wild populations. We had a sandhill bird that we knew to be, I think it was late 30s, almost 40 years old in the wild, a bird that had been banded in the early 80s and was still seen up till around 2020 or something. And so they can live quite a long time in the wild, but in captivity, we've had some incredible stories. We had a Siberian crane that hit almost 80 years in captivity. It was known in captivity during World War I in Germany. We ended up with this bird called Wolf, and he survived at the Crane Foundation until 1989. When I first started the Crane Foundation, I met the bird, and he was also reproductively viable until I think it was in its 60s or 70s. So pretty amazing bird.
From World War I.
That is a long-lived bird. So when you take away the predators and the challenges, and you feed them plenty of crane chow in captivity every day, they can live a long time. So yeah, we had a 52-year-old Saris crane that died recently as well. Really getting up there for a bird for sure. Yeah. So yeah.
You've mentioned so much of your work is involving people, and particularly governments, getting government policy that's amenable to conservation. I think some people at least in the conservation movement feel politics is sort of a dirty business, and that we shouldn't get involved with it. We should become more purists in their view. What's your view on that? Having been so successful, and it's been such an integral part of your operations and your successes in the world.
Well, I think, not, I'm going to say this in like the double negative, but not working with government is not a luxury that we have. I mean, cranes are in protected areas across Asia and across Africa and here, whether it's, Fish and Wildlife Service in our refuges here or in nature reserves in China. And even when they're out in private lands, they're heavily affected by policies around hunting and land use. And also, I guess from our view, we don't really have much of a choice, but I think, we do work closely with governments, and we try to influence how lands are managed. So like a lot of our work in China is trying to train wetland managers who work for, work under the government and work in protected areas, trying to introduce ideas like natural variability in wetlands, that it's good when water levels fluctuate. And in dry, you need certain wetlands that will be still have water in really dry years, and others that will be shallow in really wet years, and sort of this mosaic of different kinds of wetlands on the landscape. So so we do work really closely with different governments for that reason. And by and large, I think it's been fruitful to do so, and not without its challenges, but essential certainly to their recovery.
Well, especially working worldwide where you have such different cultures in 50 countries.
Yeah, yeah. Nice. Many different
Look,
kinds
look
of
what we have in the United States.
Yeah, no,
ostensibly one country.
Yeah. No, many challenges with that, but it's we've been fortunate in that, as I said early on, a lot of governments have committed land to cranes, and in a lot of ways, as you kind of heard with these stories, our challenge is that the public themselves are bought into these protected areas so that they'll last. Otherwise, they're constantly under threat. And if the public, if the local communities don't support these protected areas, they really don't have much future in a lot of places. I mean, we've seen that here in the US too, right? And we certainly see that overseas. So it's absolutely critical to find that common ground and get that support.
That's been a real change in the conservation aspect, hasn't it been, of looking at the human component instead of just putting fences or making these reserves inviolate, and,
Right.
and not taking into account the needs of the people around it that are affected.
No, that's right. And some people, still really support the fortress idea that, we need a lot of protected areas that are untouched, but it's just not going to work in a lot of places that we work. Africa being a great example with population growth and all. The fortresses won't be supported by people, and ultimately they'll be degazetted or they'll move out of protection. We see that when the public is really fiercely against these areas. So we just feel working for their buy-in, support, and getting their own values from it is the way to ensure people appreciate them. Yeah.
Well, your background and your experiences and your training all come together in this crane project, don't they? I mean, economics, hydrology, oh yeah, biology, sociology.
Well, I'm sure you see it in a lot of the bird conservation world out there too. But one of the things I love is, we have on staff, sociologists, and we have people in all kinds of different backgrounds. And it's wonderful because really everybody has to play a part in these things. And more as we go into working with farmers and ranchers and all on private lands, it's really those people skills are really critical. Work together and try to find common ground in those areas for the good of the birds. Yeah.
Well, congratulations and keep up the good work. And if people want to donate to ICF, you have your website. What's your website? They can do that through your website?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that. I always love to hear that question. But yeah, we're www.savingcranes.org. I'm sure if you typed in International Crane Foundation, you'd find us pretty easily. But right on our website. We're a membership organization, and we love to have, we've about 10,000 members, and we would welcome you to the flock, as we say, and learn more about all the things we're doing. And we release a lot of videos and things to members that people collect. And when we were chatting before this program, we're so lucky because we get just amazing, people get inspired by these birds and send us the most amazing works of art, photographs and videos and paintings and graphics. And it's really a fun luxury of being associated with these birds that we get so much beautiful stuff.
Well, thanks again.